Imagine you're walking down a cobblestone street in medieval Europe. You hear music, but you don't see any musicians. It's just the sound of feet scraping against the stones. It's because people are dancing. Not celebrating, they aren't smiling, they're just dancing for hours, for days, until their feet split open, until some of them collapse, and until their hearts simply give out. Well, in the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, something happened that still doesn't sit right with historians. Hundreds of people began dancing uncontrollably. Many couldn't stop, and some simply danced until they died. Now, this wasn't some kind of a music festival. This wasn't a cult ritual. This was panic in motion. So tonight on Dead Range, we're stepping into one of the strangest medical and spiritual events to ever happen in the history of Europe. It was the dancing plague of 1518. And the deeper we're going to look into this, the weirder it's going to get. It started with one woman. Her name was Frau Trophea, and in July of 1518, she walked onto the cobblestone street and she began to dance. She didn't have any music, she didn't have an audience, she just had wild, repetitive, exhaustive motion. And the neighbors assumed she was having a breakdown. I mean, what would you think if one of your neighbors walked into the street and began dancing for hours without ceasing? Even her husband went out and reportedly begged her to stop, and she simply could not do it. And then for nearly a full week, she continued dancing. And she did it until she collapsed, and she got back up again. And then, something worse happened. Others joined in, and within days, dozens were dancing. Within weeks, it was hundreds. City records describe people as jerking, hopping, spinning, and not joyfully, not rhythmically. It was more like convulsing, but with intent. Some of the dancers screamed, some of the dancers cried, some of them were begging for mercy. And according to historical reports, several died from heart attack, stroke, or general exhaustion. Now we gotta pause right here, because imagine being a medieval city official. You don't have modern neurology, you don't have modern psychiatry, you don't even have germ theory. All you see is the population of your city literally dancing themselves to death. Now, here's where this becomes almost a dark comedy, because the city council consulted physicians. And if we know anything about medieval physicians, what did they prescribe? Well, on account of the dancers being diagnosed with hot blood, their treatment was to dance, to get rid of it. No, I'm not kidding about this. They built a wooden stage, they hired musicians, and they encouraged the afflicted to dance it out. Just so we're all clear what's going on here, that would be like trying to cure insomnia with a strobe light. That'd be like jumping off the top of a building, breaking both your legs, and your doctor came up and was like, hey, walk it off, buddy. And then predictably, it got a lot worse. Some accounts say as many as 400 people were dancing at the height of this plague. Eventually, after we discovered that none of that worked, officials began taking the opposite approach. They banned music, they outlawed dancing, and they marched some of the worst sufferers to the shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, who's traditionally associated with things like neurological disorders. So, pilgrims were fitted with red shoes and then led in prayer rituals. And slowly, the plague stopped. But why did it begin? All right, let's go ahead and break this down. One of the most common explanations, a lot like the Salem witch trials, is ergot poisoning. So ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, and it contains alkaloids that are chemically similar to LSD. And if you eat enough of it, you can experience hallucinations, convulsions, muscle spasms, and delusion. That sounds promising, right? Wrong. Because here's the problem with that. Ergot poisoning, which was also called St. Anthony's fire, typically causes severe pain, gangrene, and violent seizures. Victims often can't stand, and these dancers were definitely standing. They were upright for days. They were still coordinated enough to move in patterns, which is not typical ergot behavior. Also, ergot outbreaks typically affect entire regions that are consuming contaminated goods. And the 1518 event seems concentrated and selective. So, while ergot poisoning might explain hallucinations, it doesn't really explain, endurance of dancing. So here's the leading academic theory. Mass psychogenic illness, otherwise known as mass hysteria to those of us who aren't nerds. Strasbourg in 1518 was under a bunch of stress. They were facing famine, disease, political instability, and a little bit of religious anxiety. And the people believed in a few things that we would probably be well to believe in ourselves: curses and divine punishment. They believed Saint Vitus could afflict them with uncontrollable dancing. So this theory goes, extreme stress plus belief in curses plus social contagion equals extreme dancing outbreak. And then once other people saw all of their friends dancing, expectation shaped behavior. It was like a feedback loop of fear. We actually have some modern parallels of this as well. In 1962, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic hit. The Salem witch trials happened back in the 1600s, which I told you we'd kind of get back into that, and that's going to be a whole video on its own at some point. We've had various outbreaks of fainting in schools and phantom illnesses amongst teenagers, and the list continues to go on. But here's the problem with the mass hysteria theory. Mass hysteria usually only lasts a few hours, maybe a couple of days. It certainly doesn't go on for weeks at a time. And it definitely doesn't get to the point of a significant number of cardiovascular deaths. Which means, and I believe, that this wasn't just people playing along. There was something physiological happening here. Alright, now this theory is the one that I probably lean closest towards with this entire situation. We're going to be stepping into the territory that medieval people who were typically more spiritually convicted actually believed. You see, Europe had experienced similar events before. They called them dancing manias. And it would typically be entire groups that would dance in frenzied states, sometimes claiming visions. And in a deeply spiritual society, which they had at the time, unexplained physical phenomena were often attributed to a few things: divine punishment, saintly curses, or demonic influence. Now, speaking from my perspective and having my faith, it's not really the Christian worldview to see something strange happen and immediately scream demons. But unlike a lot of society, we don't just write off the spiritual realm as though it doesn't exist. And as Christians, we know that it does. The Bible mentions possession, the Bible mentions demonic affliction, and we've seen these mass spiritual panics occur in the past. And what makes 1518 so fascinating is that once the participants were brought into prayer, it stopped. Now, people can claim that this was just coincidence, they can claim that they were experiencing psychological relief, but I believe that it was something else. Now, there's another outside theory that some researchers believe in, and that's that the dancers were experiencing some kind of encephalitis, or brain inflammation. Others in the same vein have posited that it's some kind of autoimmune response triggered by an infection. And they believe this because certain neurological conditions do cause some of the symptoms we saw here. Those symptoms include things like chorea, which is involuntary dance-like motions, muscle spasms, and repetitive motor behavior. There's even a condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which is historically known as Saint Vitus' dance. But here's the catch. Neurological conditions don't spread socially in waves. They don't affect hundreds simultaneously through observation, unless stress were to have triggered this expression in predisposed individuals. But I really don't find that likely, and it's certainly not airtight. Strasbourg in 1518 was not a thriving community. They had crop failures, starvation, high taxation, a disease, and some historians argue that this was just this collective trauma being visibly manifest. They put forward that the body was trying to express something that the soul just couldn't. And when people feel powerless for long enough, something typically breaks. Sometimes it's rebellion, sometimes it's hysteria, and sometimes it's dancing until your heart explodes. And the more haunting part, like I mentioned before, this wasn't the only dancing plague in Europe. There were similar outbreaks in the 14th and the 15th centuries in the Rhine region. And that suggests a cultural, spiritual, or psychological component that was present in specifically that place at that time. Now we'll just get into a little bit of myth busting about the case itself. A lot of people claim that about 15 people died per day. That number is pretty hotly debated. We know that some deaths did occur, but the records from Strasbourg are incomplete. And so we don't actually know the total, which makes this worse, because it means we're dealing with only partial evidence for a real tragedy that over time has been wrapped up in folklore and in fear. Now, a lot of people can kind of pick and choose different aspects of each one of these explanations in order to draw a conclusion. You could say it's a combination of extreme stress, religious expectation, social contagion, possibly, I guess, minor toxin exposure through ergot, and maybe even just neurological vulnerability. People try to rationalize it, and it might not have been just one cause. But it reminds us of something deeper. Human beings aren't just biological machines. We aren't just chemical reactions happening within our own brains. We are spiritual beings as well. And so no matter which one of these explanations you believe, it gets you thinking. Because fear can spread physically, society under pressure fractures in really strange ways, and spiritual warfare is real. And sometimes it looks like dancing. So, in 1518, the streets of Strasbourg became a stage. There was no orchestra, there was no celebration. It was just a terrifying reality that the body or the spirit can override the will. And maybe the creepiest part, if pressure builds up like that again in society, history suggests that this could happen again. Maybe not quite as a dancing plague, but as something just as strange. This has been Dead Range. And if you ever feel like dancing uncontrollably for 6 days straight, maybe check your bread and pray.